the horrors that I experienced when I was in my coma were so terrifyingly vivid. And some of them were, there were, think back, quite ridiculous, and obviously they weren't real, but I wasn't aware of that because I didn't have any sort of sense of self. I wasn't Aron with a history and experiences. I was just the observer and the person who had these experiences. So, in one kind of horror vignette that I had, um, I found myself a giant, and the whole planet was laid out before me like an atlas. But I could see every human being on the planet. They were all looking at me, and they were not happy, and they were pointing and shouting at me. And I was being blamed for every bad experience that ever befell humankind. And the hatred was coming off them in waves. And I could feel it viscerally. I could feel the hate. And I remember their faces contorted with anger and pointing and screaming, and anything from the trivial to the most extreme. I was being blamed for. I hadn't done them, but I was being blamed. It was my responsibility. So um, somebody shouting, "I have back pain. It's your fault." But then, a woman hysterical, screaming and pointing at me, saying, "My daughter was raped, and it was your fault." And a little elderly Jewish gentleman pointing at me, "The Holocaust was your fault." I hadn't done any of these things, but I was responsible that they happened. Somebody had to be held accountable, and it was me, apparently. And that went on for days, just waves of hate. The guilt was just, the guilt I felt was just unbearable. And then there were ones that were kind of a twisting of reality. So my partner Karen had visited, and she brought a brother with her, and um, they'd obviously lowered my sedation because I must have had an awareness, and I opened my eyes at some point, and then I must have seen Karen and her brother. And then this image shifted, and I found myself sat in what looked like a typical hospital coffee shop. It was deserted, and I sat on my own. And a brother walked in and sat down and looked me dead in the eyes and said, "For what you've done to her, I've got two men, I've paid them, and they've got a van, and you don't know when, and you don't know where, but they're going to kidnap you, drive you away, break every one of your fingers and every one of your toes." And he just paused and looked at me and got up and walked out. And I just sat thinking of this, and it seemed plausible in my, sedated state that this was real. And then he walked back in and sat back down. For the upset you've caused to her, I paid two men. They've got a van. You don't know where, you don't know when, but they're going to kidnap you, drive you away, and make every one of your fingers and every one of your toes. And paused and looked at me, and then walked out. And this went on loop, over and over and over again. Skin has gone a bit cold thinking about it. But yeah, and when I was writing the book about my experience, I remember Karen reading what I'd written, and I described the scene. And she said that she remembered one day very distinctly that her and her brother was visiting me, and I kind of opened my eyes and sleepily down, drowsily, looked at her and looked at him. My eyes just sort of looks of terror, and then lights went out again. So presumably that was it. And the third one that really kind of, well, they all stick with me. They're all kind of burnt into my memory. But one of the ones that was particularly unpleasant was again, I had visitors and they must have lowered my sedation. And I've got an older brother and a younger brother. And I must have been aware that they were there and they were obviously worried because whether I was going, like, they'd seen me lying there with tubes in me and the ventilator and the machines. And I remember kind of, I didn't have form. I was just kind of floating above a kind of an arid desert landscape. And I looked down and there was my two brothers, but there were hundreds of copies of them. And I was floating above them. I don't know, there must have been 200 of each of them copies. And they were naked. And they were looking up at me and their terrors in their faces. And I just watched as their arms were pulled, the shoulder sockets and the hip joints just pulled out as if they were kind of attached to four horses, and saw the sinews. And this is, high definition quality image. And they pulled their arms out and their stomachs would rip open and the internal organs would kind of fall out and then their heads would pull back. The sinews of the neck would stretch and the heads would come off. And all the time they were looking at me, kind of pleading. And then there'd be a puff of smoke, and then the little copy would vanish, and then put another puff of smoke, and a new one would appear. And I was just watching this, just hundreds and hundreds of times. Yeah, and that lasted, I think, about 5 days. Well, yeah, that's the kind of thing that people can experience. And I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one. I spoke to people who've had equally horrific experiences. Thanks for watching.